For those of you who aren't familiar with the depositions, I do want to just say a few words about them. A major rebellion breaks out in Ireland in October 1641. And for those of you who know nothing about Irish history, remember this is the age of colonisation. Ireland was England's first colony, and you can see the rising of 1641 as a reaction against a very intensive period of colonisation. What you have here in front of you is the leader of the rising, a man called Phelim O'Neill, and a visualisation of the depositions that records the numbers of killings. Because actually, this is one of the darkest moments in Irish history. More people lost their lives during the 1640s than at any other point in our island's troubled history. We don't know the exact number, but we know it was very significant indeed. And the depositions obviously record that. Now, before I say anything else about the deposition, a big health warning here, because the depositions record incidents of mass killing, ethnic cleansing, and atrocity, but they do it primarily from the perspective of the Protestant colonial elite. We don't have a body of records that does it from the perspective of the Catholic community. So as we use these records, you have to be very aware that you're just hearing the story primarily from one side. And obviously the Catholic population suffered equally, if not greater, losses than the Protestant population. This is what the depositions looked like when they came to Trinity in 1751. Here they are in their 18th century bindings. There are 31 volumes in all over in the Long Room. For those of you, have you all been to the Long Room? Yes, it's absolutely exquisite. And it's very much home to the depositions. We've got volumes that cover the entire country. As I say, there's 31 in all. Actually, Ulster is for the province for which the depositions are best known, but it's actually Leinster and Munster for which we've got the greatest number of depositions, and especially County Cork. And there's a story that I needn't bore you with here, why County Cork. It's the way that they were collected. So those are the depositions. In a little bit more detail, you're looking at around 8,000 witness testimonies. So a vast number of documents. And where they're so valuable to us as historians is that they record every aspect of everyday life. So they're very important sources for the social, the economic, but also the religious, political and military history of early modern Ireland. They're also unique. There is no other country in the early modern world that would have a body of material like this. And given though their problematic nature, they're also amongst the most controversial records in Irish history. So when we took this on, we were aware of the challenges involved. Now, this is what the depositions look like. Anyone want to volunteer to read them for me? Elizabeth Ann, you've got great paleography. Yeah, well, actually, these are in English, but you're right. Some of them could easily be in Latin. It's just a single example of what the depositions look like. They're a right mess, I think, is a good way of putting it. Very difficult to read. We've got lots of issues with the ink bleeding through, multiple hands, lots of crossing out. And in the language of the computer scientists, they call it dirty data. Now, I was really insulted when everybody started talking about this dirty data. But really, it's about the lack of consistency in everything. Case, punctuation, syntax, spelling, semantics, so on and so forth. I think, though, the other big lesson that I got working with the computer scientists was actually the great respect I have for their work, but the fact that they regarded us as the domain specialists. There was a great partnership that developed. I'll come back to that in a moment. But of course, the big challenge was, how do you capture this dirty data, both structured and semi-structured? And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Before I do that, I just want to explain why the depositions are so significant and why we wanted to do this project. The reason they're so significant is that the depositions are part of an identity myth. So the Protestant loyalist community living on the island of Ireland believe, as part of their identity myth, that the 1641 rebellion began with, if you want, a premeditated murder of the Protestant population by the Catholic population. And the depositions have been trotted out over the centuries, in a sense, to beat the Catholic population with. So they're extremely sensitive for these reasons. And this drowning, it's a 1642 woodcut of Protestants at the bridge at Portadown, is one of the iconic images that we associate. So we've got the depositions, obviously, recording this, and this is the visual of it. And this image actually appears on many banners of Orangemen. So these Protestant loyalist Orangemen who march in the north of Ireland to this day. Now, what you have here is Oliver Cromwell rather than Portadown drownings, but you also have the Portadown drownings. The reason I've got Cromwell here was, of course, the other great identity myth in terms of Irish identity are the massacres that Cromwell committed at Drogheda and then at Wexford in revenge for 1641, where he said we have to revenge the Protestant blood that was spilt. So as I say, these documents are very much at the heart of Irish identity. So when we decided to digitize this material and make it available online, we realized that we were progressing into quite dangerous territory. And our attempt to do this project actually represented the third attempt. So there'd been two previous attempts, one in the 1930s, one in the 1960s, both of which had failed largely because World War II broke out in the 30s, and then the Troubles broke out in the 1960s. And it was only when the island of Ireland that was at peace that we could actually do this project. It was very much a collaboration between Trinity, Aberdeen and Cambridge. And the reason was that we knew from the outset we were going to need €1 million to digitise and transcribe the depositions, and there was no funding agency in Ireland at that time who could fund it. So we knew that we had to go into the riches of our colleagues in the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, but the Irish Research Council also contributed. I think it was $250,000, and Trinity College Library another 100,000. Those were in the days when our library had money. Very important partnership here. Especially with IBM Languageware, and I'm so delighted that Mary Wallace, Mary, can you wave your hands, from IBM is here, because it was the beginning of an extraordinarily important partnership with IBM, and obviously the relationship with Mary and her colleagues continues to this day. And maybe in the Q&A, Mary can say a few things about what their involvement is and why physicists, mathematicians, and the team at IBM was actually interested in working in a digital humanities project, because the objectives were very clear from the outset. We wanted to conserve the unconserved manuscripts, we wanted to digitize them, we wanted then to mark them up at TEI. Again, the metadata was very important. But I'm a cynic, and I don't believe that you can future-proof anything in a digital world. So we also wanted to print the hard copy. So 12 volumes are coming out with the Irish Manuscripts Commission. The first 4 are already out. But above all, of course, then we have the online version. Again, I don't know if people are familiar with the online version. It's all freely available online. We now have over 23,000 registered users who are actively using the website. Prior to that, prior to digitizing and putting them online, about 20 people a year would have had access to the depositions. So it really has transformed access. This is the website. Again, if you're familiar with it, just to give you a flavor of it. For me, what's terribly important is the transcriptions can be checked against the originals. So in other words, if you're not happy with the transcriptions, then go back to the originals. So the project was finished, and it was very much a team effort. It was finished on time, within budget, and over spec. But we were also very conscious that the project had become, if you want, part of the Northern Ireland peace process, the Irish peace process. And because we had sort of tinkered with identity and memory, we wanted to launch it in a very, I think, we wanted to launch it in a very dignified way, a very respectful way, and no better woman to do it than the then President of Ireland, who, of course, the theme of her presidency had been building bridges on the island of Ireland. But we were also very conscious that Mary McAleese only represented one side of the community. So we invited this man to join her on the podium. Now, for those of you who don't know Ireland, this man is called Ian Paisley, Lord Bandside, and he would have been an example of who, back during the Troubles, would have been a demagogue who would have used 1641 as a stick to beat basically his Catholic opponents. So it was very important for us to have both of these people at the podium. And that was an incredible night. And I don't know, a couple of you in the room were there when Paisley and McAleese shared a podium. I grew up in Belfast during the Troubles. I never thought I would see it happen. And both of them said, this is a hugely important project. It's about bowing to the past without being bound by the past. And it's only by doing these sorts of projects that actually we can move forward as a people. And actually, the depositions have been important in terms of the Northern Ireland peace process, but we've also then used them in other contexts, particularly myself in Sri Lanka. But I won't talk about that now and come back to it because it's the digital humanities bit. It became a flagship digital humanities project. I think we've gone on to raise in excess of €5 million, most of it either from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK or from Framework 7 and European funding. Of all of the projects that the depositions have spawned, probably the most important was Cultura, which did a whole range of things, including more personalised working environments, some wonderful mapping tools. But for me, the most interesting was the normalisation of the 17th century spelling. And remember, single words could have 27 variant spellings. So it was really important that we could produce normalized text, and that's what the Cultura project did. We also took depositions into the classroom, and there's a separate website for school children, really aimed at 14, 16-year-olds, widely used in Northern Ireland, but anyone can use it. And it actually has become a model then for ERI, which is another digital humanities research infrastructure around the Holocaust, which is developing modules as well for school children. So that's the project in a nutshell. I want to now reflect a little bit on the future and then conclude with lessons learned. So in terms of what's next, we made a number of big mistakes at the outset. While everything we do is open source, our metadata isn't easily visible. And that's created lots and lots of problems. And I don't understand the technical reasons behind it. I just know that it's making interoperability a big challenge. So we need to look at that. We also need to think how we integrate these amazing tools that we've developed, like the normalization text that Cultura has developed, how we integrate that into the main website. but also the other tools, not just the normalized text. We've got some fabulous visualization tools, some lovely mapping ones. We did some great work with IBM using natural language processing, which allows for some very, very sophisticated linguistic analysis. Again, how can those tools actually be integrated into the main website? And for me, above all, it's about interoperability, because I hate to say it, we created effectively a digital silo. The 1641 Depositions is not easily interoperable with the other big data sets that are being produced, things like the Books of Survey and Distribution, which are the doomsday books for 17th century Ireland, the petty maps that I just skipped through, or the statute staple records. And for me, that actually is a big issue, that we didn't set it up at the outset that allowed us, we just didn't think about the future. And again, anything that you guys can learn from this, please do. However, having beaten myself up, I also, the final thing I would want to say is we didn't engage enough with our user communities at the outset. And again, I'm so sorry that we didn't listen more to what people actually wanted. Now, I'm not saying we didn't get many things right, but I think we could have done more by engaging more at the outset. However, we have spawned a huge amount of research, and for me, this is what it's all about. Lots of PhD theses, lots of monographs, lots of other web-based digital resources. A gentleman in Gujarat contacted me, said could he translate the Depositions into Hindi. I said, be my guest. You know, it's fabulous, you know, to have that global engagement and having some very, very, very high quality research coming out of it. And again, from a very selfish perspective, I decided that I wanted to actually use the Depositions for my own research. So I'm doing a big project on 17th century widows, because there's a very high number of women recorded in the Depositions, and many of the women are actually widows in waiting if they're not already widows. So I thought, I'm going to set myself a challenge. I am just going to use technology to identify these widows. And the first challenge obviously was the variant spellings. So there were 18 different spellings of the word widow, 9 of the word wife. Anyway, I thought Cultura, you know, can sort that out for me, and that was fine. So using technology alone, I identified 421 widows. But you know, I'm a historian, and I'm always slightly nervous about just being reliant on technology. So I couldn't resist just checking and reading the originals. And guess what? All of a sudden, there were 91 widows that the technology hadn't brought up that a close reading of the Depositions revealed. Now that's enough to give you a panic attack. And I certainly was extremely concerned. And this was then the challenge. Back to the technology people, what's going on here? Why? Well, one obvious thing were the variant spellings. I've already mentioned that. But also you have to use alternative language. So the word relict, but actually we got that. But had we got late wife, late the wife, formerly wife, now the wife, late husband, former husband, husband deceased, formerly married. You know, there were so many variations in terms of search terms. But the other thing is, when is a widow not a widow? When she remarries, you know, so again, it wasn't picking this up. You needed the human intervention there to identify it. But there were other issues. We had issues with our surname search box. We still haven't sorted those out. Issues with the forename and surname search didn't return the relevant widow. I don't understand why it didn't. The technology people are working on that. The advanced occupation search, again, wasn't doing what it should have been doing. On 3 occasions, and it was only 3, there was incorrect data entry. And it was just a space in the wrong place. It was as little as that. So for me, the only solution here is to read the Depositions. Technology takes you only so far. And this sort of resource takes you only so far. There's no excuse for not actually reading. And it has made my life very interesting, very exciting. And certainly I wouldn't have begun this project if the technology hadn't have taken me in there. But as I say, so what are the lessons learned? Just to wrap this up. Firstly, is technology is transformative, but it's no substitute for reading the original document. The importance of infrastructure and standards. And this goes back to some of the points that you were making, Tim. We need to follow these rigorously, especially if we are trying to achieve interoperability and get away from these digital silos, which the 1641 deposition sadly is one. Issues around sustainability. Our money ran out in 2010. So who pays for the constant upgrading of the 1641 website? The answer is Trinity does, because it's part of our high performance computing outfit. But if Trinity wasn't here, I'm not sure I could, it would just be effectively another orphan website. And for me, these issues around future-proofing these digital resources is a very major concern, and is why I've got this healthy skepticism around it as well. I think the system developed only as good as the data. There's always going to be errors, but as I say, they're very, very few. But also, I think changing research questions require agile data. So we need to be thinking about, I don't know what a researcher in 100 years' time, what sort of questions they want to ask. How can we create data that's extremely agile and flexible? And I don't have the answer to that. I think the final lesson learned for me was about reciprocity. And the importance of the domain specialists talking to each other. It's all about people. It's all about those people being very respectful of what each other's doing, each getting something out of it, and of creating this interdependence. I saw that in our interactions with IBM and with Marie Wallace and her colleagues. I see this in our interactions with our computer science colleagues and with our colleagues in the library. It's how you set these projects up where everybody's a winner. Thank you very much.